All right. Well, good morning or good day, depending on in which time zone you are, beloved audience. Super exciting that you could join here today's masterclass about ITOM, and more specifically, the topic around SRE, so Site Reliability Engineering, and how that relates to ServiceNow. Because this is a very hot topic. We have seen ServiceNow done recent acquisitions in the space. They have bought up some technologies. And in general, I think that we're seeing the industry trend when we're speaking about IT operations, especially moving towards the world of SREs. Hence, we thought it was a great idea to arrange a 1-hour session where we just kind of touch the basics concepts around it and really kind of dive into it and what it's all about, especially in the context of ServiceNow. Just some housekeeping things before we get started. The session is being recorded, so for all of you on the webinar, or for those of you who are watching this at a later stage, then yeah, you will be able to find it on YouTube. It will also be sent out in the email that is going out after the webinar, as well as there is a Q&A box, which means that you can actually type questions and you can ask us in the speakers any questions that you might have, and we will either read it straight in the webinar and try to answer it, or if we don't have time, we will get back to you personally later. So I think that is it from a housekeeping perspective. We have roughly 1 hour with 58 minutes left, but before we get started, I think it makes sense to actually give a proper introduction of who we are. So me who speaks right now, my name is Alexander Ljungström, and currently I'm patching in from Amsterdam, where I'm located. Originally I'm Swedish though, and it's actually a sunny day here, so it's quite nice with the summer coming back. But I work as the managing director for Einar Partners, and personally I am super passionate about this topic of SREs, because what we see is that the world of IT operations is becoming more and more complex, and everything that has to do with it, so machine learning, people and processes, that is something which I am personally very enthusiastic about. So in the past, I have also worked at ServiceNow in their ITOM team, and I've spent the best well of, I think, 10 years only focusing on this area pretty much. So super excited to have you all on board here today and speak about it. Luckily, I am not only myself here today, but I have my good friend Tapio with me. So Tapio, who are you?
Oh, thanks. My name is Tapio Silvera. I am a senior solution consultant at the Cloud People. I've been working with ServiceNow for approximately 8 years, helping customers with their IT operations and mainly getting them up to speed on modern practices and help them develop their business.
Super cool. And where are you located again, Tapio, for the audience?
I'm actually in the center of Finland in Kuopio.
Center of Finland. All right. Super cool. I see we already have a question right now from Stefan in the audience, and he is asking, will we have an access to the recording? And indeed, you will all have access to the recording, so you can send it to all your friends. All right, so what do you say, Tapio? Should we kick this off then?
Yes, please.
All right. Now, just high level here, what we will go through today. Of course, the area of observability is huge, and we're kind of opening the Pandora's box here a little bit. So we have to be disciplined in where we put the level of, let's say, knowledge. It shouldn't be too high, shouldn't be too low. And because it's a very broad topic, we cannot touch upon everything. With that being said, the areas you see in front of you here, mainly redefining the CMDB. So as we all know, the beloved child of CMDB has been a discussion for best 20 years soon. How does that actually needs to be redefined in the world of SRE? We will speak a little bit about connecting data. So how can we connect different data points and how can we ensure success there? How can we act on data? So automation, machine learning, that type of topics. And then finally, if you stay to the end, I will speak very, very practical from a ServiceNow perspective about the journey. So this is not your usual sales type of lingo or talk, but It's very practical advice based on over 30 implementations that I have overseen in this area of how you actually can reach further in your journey of SRE operations. But before we get started, I want to speak first a little bit about the complexity and madness that we are seeing in the world of IT operations today. And me personally, it's all about finding this, what I call golden formula. So in the terms of complexity and madness, there was recently a Forrester report. And in this Forrester report, they interviewed over 400 enterprises. And the data that you're seeing here on the left side are the results of that Forrester report. I have only picked out some of the KPIs here, but essentially 25% of the organizations were using 50 or more monitoring tools. 40% of the organizations were receiving more than 1 million events on a daily basis, and 11% of them over 10 million of events on a daily basis. And this is just speaking about monitoring and events, really. Because this picture in front of you here is something which is very common and that we're seeing today, that in the past, IT operations used to be fairly centralized. It used to be fairly easy. It was the IT department. They had their servers, they had their databases, they had their data centers, they had their support staff. Now, everything is IT. Everything is data. You have probably, a lot of you have already heard the terminology, data is the new gold. And I think that, or no, data is the new oil is what they're saying. And I think that's very true. So we see so many different data points, so many different variables, anything from operate to deliver, to how we build things, to how we plan things, employees, partners, strategy, customers, integrations, clouds, yada, yada, you name it. And all of these things are generating data. So really what we're trying to do, all enterprises today, is the first step is really trying to take all of these data points, then try to categorize them, and then finally to truly structure them. If enterprises are successful with this mission, in my opinion, that means that they are also truly on the path towards becoming data-driven, without using buzzwords. But this is for me what it's about when we say being data-driven, really. So for sure, it's very complex. And I don't know, Tapio, I guess you have seen a similar trend in your past 8 years when you have working with enterprises, right?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. So it's really crazy. And then if we're looking then quickly, kind of just setting the stage here of, let's say, establishing the nature and definitions of SRE practices. So by the way, I think it was 2003 already, Google introduced the terminology SRE, and it stands for Site Reliability Engineering. And whenever we speak about SRE practices, it usually have a few things in common, a few pillars. This is not all of them, granted. I have picked out the ones which I find the most interesting. But starting from the left bottom side here, then we always see that SREs tends to be decentralized. So what we mean with that is you tend to move away from having a centralized IT department to have decentralized autonomous teams. And the reason for this is that each team being allowed full freedom and flexibility, the philosophy at least is that it should increase productivity and kind of fail fast, fix fast approach. But it's really all focused on IT service reliability. And of course, you on the call might now think, but hey, isn't this what we have done in ITIL and IT for forever, for 20 years? And yeah, that's true. But when we speak about IT service reliability from an SRE perspective, it's really about determining what is the specific level of service reliability that we need to meet for different applications or services, and what are the earliest and the best indicators, let's say, for how we can indicate a service degradation. So it's all about finding those benchmarks and those KPIs. And often what we see here is that SRE teams, they work with new concepts such as error budgets. They are allowed to have failures. SLOs, so service level objectives. So for example, what should be the uptime, what should be the availability, and that type of things. So it's a little bit of a shift compared to the normal traditional ITIL-based approach, but yet the end goal, in my opinion, is the same, which is IT service reliability, really. Then, of course, we have quantifiable monitoring, so things should be measurable. How do we actually monitor and ensure this service reliability? How do we automate things? Because automation is key, and you, Tapio, will speak about this just in a bit. And then finally, what we also see when we speak about SRE are CI/CD and DevOps. So these things together constitutes the majority of SRE activities, I'd say. And this is a huge shift for a lot of enterprises and a lot of organizations to try and incorporate this new, very dynamic way of operating them. Oh, now I went here too fast. So with that being said, Tapio, speaking of automation, maybe you could go ahead and share the screen from here. And
yes, I will do that.
Speak a little bit about TOIL.
Before we jump to that, I want to add one little notion here to this point.
Yes.
SRE originally wasn't something that Google was public about. That was something that they kept as a secret inside their organization. And they only later on came public with it. So it was their internal secret, or their secret sauce, as they called it.
Okay, I didn't know that actually.
Yeah, and I think you can sort of see it in some of the practices. They sort of kept some things secret first. Okay, going on to the components here. So can you see the next screen? I believe you do. Yes. So the thing that we're or a topic that we're going to discuss is TOIL. I'm sure many of you have not heard the term, and well, some of you most likely have, but there are still a lot of who have not heard the term, and I want to come back to this in a bit. So that's why I'm going to define it. TOIL is a task that is usually manual, something that your SREs will go and do. It's usually repetitive, which means that it's not done just once. You will have to do it again and again. Obviously, when there is something that is done by a human and it's manual process and it's repetitive, you can automate it. Then you would actually ask why not just automate it straight away? And there's the development lifecycle. When you have development and then you have TOIL, they sort of try to cancel, or TOIL starts to slow down development. TOIL is often reactive. So basically, you don't plan it. It comes to you and you have to take care of it. Something happens in your environment or your systems or your services, and you have to go and fix it. So you're responding to something happening. Then very, very crucial indicator here is that it doesn't have any enduring value, meaning once you go and do your action, you fix or you close or complete the TOIL, it doesn't mean that it won't appear again. You'll most likely have to do it again at some point. Basically, you're going from a change state back to the previous state that you were in. So your system will stay in the same state as before. And the worst part of this is the amount of TOIL, the volume of TOIL grows relative to the growth of your service and your business. And that is a very, very crucial point here. And we'll talk about that a bit more.
Just one thing before you continue. Some practical examples here, maybe. Would you say that TOIL, could it be, for example, running scripts, rebooting servers, rolling back? What type of activities could be categorized as TOIL in your opinion?
I'd like to give an example from the ServiceNow world. So ServiceNow often relies on workflows. You define something, a process, and then you try to automate it. When you're designing your flows, you take into consideration the state that your environment is now, and perhaps some changes that you're expecting to happen. But we just don't have the capacity to, predict everything that's going to change. And then the processes and the flows that you've designed, they lack a capability of doing something automatically. And then something unexpected happens in your system and you have to go and fix it. Oftentimes, you'll create a script for example, from my past experience, we had a flow for change management, and it wasn't capable of switching a specific state if something occurred, which required you to go and fix it via script. Now, that is fairly simple. After the first time, you'll have to go and do it again. There's a very small part of human evaluation there, but technically the evaluation could be done by a machine as well. So then some operator goes and runs a script to fix the state back to what it was before, so that your process continues on. Basically, something that you need to do to keep the wheels turning, keep the lights on, that kind of thing.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Thanks a lot. That makes sense. Cool.
Yeah. And that actually describes the first con. So it's an unnecessary necessary. You have to do it in order to keep your wheels turning and lights on. And the biggest con here, it causes latency or delays your service and your development. Development being the most crucial part there. Even if there is a short delay in your service, that might be acceptable. But in the long term, latency and slowness in your development will be very detrimental to your business, because in the modern world, you have to compete with all your competitors. And the best way to compete is by constantly developing, improving your business, improving your services. And TOIL is definitely one of those things that will hinder your ability to develop. And then the third con is it is most often really good at causing stress for your SREs. Obviously, there are different types of people. Some people are perfectly fine, 9 to 5, just doing TOIL. They're happy with that, and that's all they want. But then I would argue that most people are very unhappy with TOIL. Me going into that category. And yeah, TOIL is something that will hinder not just your development, but it will have long-term effects in your business, because it is causing stress and unhappiness in your employees, in your development staff. It'll cascade it to other events, meaning your developers might be unhappy and leave the company. Trying to hire new people might not be that easy, since the reputation of having to do a lot of TOIL can be something that people do not want to, be associated with or don't want to work with. Now, there are some pros to TOIL. Usually, where things like this happen, or what TOIL is associated with, or what causes TOIL, is something that is related to your core business, and you can easily use these tasks, TOIL tasks, as an onboarding task for your newcomers, so that while they're fixing the state, the situation, they get an overview of or an understanding of the system. They see what the flaws are. They have to look under the hood to see what's there, and it provides them some visibility to your business. And technically, also it can give you instant gratification. Basically, there's something wrong, and once you fix it, you feel like, okay, I accomplished something today. Normally, you might be in a meeting for 8 hours a day, and you feel like you didn't accomplish anything, and then you get a task that requires you to reboot a server or something, and then you go and do it, and then feel that I actually accomplished something meaningful today, not just discussion or not just something that I didn't find value in. Since it does provide a very small bit of value as your service is up and running still.
Could you say, Tapio, that it's an illusion of value?
Yeah, I kind of like sugar. You shouldn't really eat it, but you still want it, and you get a little high out of it afterwards. But yeah, unhealthy in the long term. And then one pro that you could say for it is it can offer you a break in a hectic development environment. I am 100% sure that most of you have experienced the hectic world of development, where you have deadlines and you have sprints and whatever, and you're constantly trying to reach your goal, and you're looking at the calendar and you see that date coming there, and then when you reach that date and you publish, and then you might afterwards, be processing TOIL, and then you sort of get a breather where you're no longer so much tied to deadlines and schedules. So that is a brief explanation of TOIL. I'll go into the next point here, which is managing TOIL. Now, Google provides.
Here, Tapio, before we jump in here, that from a timing perspective, just so you're aware, we have roughly 40 minutes left, just so you know.
Yeah, I'll be quick. I tend to talk slow and loud. Okay, Google's point of view is that you should aim for a maximum of 50% of TOIL per SRE. How Google tries to accomplish that is by having weekly rotations on their operators or developers, that you will do 1 week of primary on-call where you just handle TOIL. Secondary, next week is secondary on-call where you're also doing TOIL, and then you have 2 weeks without it. And that way you'll get 50%. So you can really easily calculate there. You need 4 people for that, minimum 4 people, or maybe with 2 if you just do 1 week TOIL, 1 week development. That really doesn't work in the real world. But if you have a larger team, you're able to spread out the weeks. You can have 1 week primary, 1 secondary, and then more weeks of development. And that way, the maximum amount of TOIL that you can have gets smaller. Google's own survey says that their employees have about 33% TOIL, which I still think is kind of high.
I was just about to say the same.
yeah. I wouldn't be happy with 30 or a third of my work time being put into just keeping the lights on. So that's why I would say that you should definitely aim for less than 25%, which means a quarter of your time, or you would like to have it less. And if you have, or if you don't have the capability to do this rotation, if your team is not big enough, if you maybe have only 1 person doing this management, then you are forced into the situation where you definitely need to manage how the TOIL occurs. You have to focus on automating it before you expand your services, because very often what happens is your sales is pushing your business to grow. And obviously you have push from sales, which is saying that we got to onboard new customers, we got to expand our services, and at the same time development operations are saying that we have so much TOIL that we just can't do it. And then you get to the argument, okay, let's fix it after we onboard this new customer or provide this new service. But like I mentioned in the previous slide, the amount of TOIL is relative to the size of your service, or as your service grows. So you might be setting yourself a trap by not taking care of your TOIL sources when you still can.
I love that you say that, because I think what people often think is that the problem will be solved if we just hire more staff or throw more support engineers on it or something. But clearly it's a matter of addressing the root cause, is what you're saying.
Yes. And with SRE's ideology is measure everything. Once you understand what TOIL is, you need to measure it. You need to understand how much we actually have. Without understanding what it is, it's really difficult to measure it. You might, because again, there are some manual tests that are not TOIL. There are some stuff that you got to do that actually brings you value, or you don't do it again another time. So important is to measure how much TOIL there is, plan on how to get rid of it. So not just saying that we got to get rid of all of it, and that's it. Plan it and then eliminate it. You might not be able to remove TOIL completely. Perhaps you can just automate part of it and reduce the amount that you have to spend, the amount of time that you have to spend in dealing with it. So move gradually. I'm skeptic in that sense that the world is never complete. Our services are never going to be perfect. So move 1 step at a time. That's the planning part. And then the goal is try to eliminate it. Sadly, we'll never reach that one.
Thanks a lot. Yeah, I think this is super important when we speak about SREs, and a great kind of setting the stage here. Because let's now go. I'm going to hijack the screen sharing from you, Tapio.
Please do.
And let's zoom in here a little bit then on the ServiceNow specific things. So the first thing which I find important here, and by the way, I'm speaking now first about redefining the CMDB. So if we're just looking at the nature of a CMDB, what you're seeing here is kind of the transgression of how infrastructure has developed over time. So 15 years ago, that's when we saw virtual machines, virtual machine containers, farms, etc. But now what we're seeing, as illustrated here in front of you, is way more like Docker, Kubernetes, containerized environments, kind of stateless applications and infrastructure as code and that type of operations, right? So the fundamental issue is that originally the CMDB was created for a world which existed 10, 15 years ago. Meanwhile, what we're seeing is that people try to fit in this new world into the concept of a CMDB, and that's where the friction gets created, because there are so many dependencies. And what I always ask myself is, do we really care about infrastructure these days? I mean, yes, we do, but at the same time, not always. Because often what we're seeing here, and like Tapio mentioned, when a service, we have some sort of service degradation or something like that, especially in a DevOps world, it is expected that the service also autoscales. So for example, we add more pods if it's Kubernetes, we add more containers if it's Docker, we add maybe more virtual machines to a cluster automatically, you name it. But fundamentally, things are autoscaling and the infrastructure becomes less of importance. And in matter of fact, infrastructure is becoming less expensive as well. Hell, like Azure gives you, I think, $300 for free just to play around. You can create an account today. So the autoscaling is huge. Tags and context. If we don't care about the machines and components in the same way anymore, what we have seen is that tags and context is way more important. So tagging the resources, what are they used for? In which context are they used? Is it a dev environment? Is it a prod environment? And so forth and so on. Things tend to be more modular. So instead of, you all know this kind of monolithic applications perhaps versus the microservice-based approach. But more specifically, what we see is that rather than having one big application or a very simple application stack, things are much, much more modular now, hence way more dependencies. But perhaps the most critical element here is that there is an entirely different level of self-service that people expect. If I am a developer in an organization, I also expect to be able to very quickly create my own resources without having to wait for approval and a virtual machine and having it imaged or whatever. I should just be able to spin up something fairly fast. So these things together is what adds to SRE operations. And if we then look at the context compared to how the CMDB was created, this obviously creates a conflict. So here's a bit of a controversial statement perhaps, but should we actually maybe stop calling it a CMDB is something I often question. Because when I hear CMDB and when I speak to people, recent grads from universities that are doing DevOps, like DevOps engineers, SRE engineers or something, and you mention the word CMDB, they think, oh shit, that is an old concept. Who is this dinosaur speaking about a CMDB? Because no one wants to be stuck in the old world, right? So in my opinion, a CMDB, that should rather be called a dynamic data layer. And this is exactly what ServiceNow is doing. And that's why also we have seen ServiceNow created something called, for example, service graph. So I think slowly we're moving towards an industry trend where the purpose of a CMDB being keeping track of things, it remains the same, but how we name it and how we interact with the CMDB will be different. So in front of you here, you have three areas. And in my opinion, then a modern CMDB should support all of these areas. So first of all, it should be component focused. So be able to capture the traditional IT, because whether we like it or not, then we still have data centers, we still have network equipment, virtual machines. We cannot just ignore those parts, especially not if you're a big enterprise. traditional IT will continue to be a part of our reality for many more decades. I'm sure of that. Yet, not everything is traditional IT. So we also need to stop being so focused on components and rather be a bit more service focused. More specifically, the CMDB should be able to support cloud resources, stateless things, and microservices. This is really important in my opinion. So not only having that component focused, but really seeing like API gateways, microservices, infrastructure as code, functions, those type of granular things. And then last but not least, state focused. So a CMDB should be able to ingest metadata and telemetry. And you might be wondering, hey, what are you meaning, Alex, with metadata? But things such as tags, things such as who owns a resource, where is the resource built, what are the cost center, that type of metadata. But through all of these layers, there should be relationships and contexts. The picture in front of you is for me what constitutes a modern CMDB. And this should be at least the minimum level of expectations when you invest into a CMDB, that it should have the ability to support all of these spectrums.
I really like to highlight the very bottom part there, the relationships and context. Even if you have all the data, if you don't have the relations between the data is unusable usually.
Yeah, exactly. Absolutely true. So we're really speaking about connecting the data and dots. And if we're gonna fill that up, then you have something to share here, Tapio, I believe, about regarding the discovery part, right?
Yes, let me share my screen. Okay, the next part was the populating of the CMDB. I split this up into two categories, the traditional discovery and cloud discovery. Traditional discovery, as Alex mentioned, it is for the traditional hardware, servers, switches, and so on. ServiceNow itself provides tools for that. There's ServiceNow discovery, and also it supports if you want to do some other third-party discovery tools, and then just populate the CMDB in ServiceNow with it. There are agentless approaches where you just blindly look for things, and based on what you find, you look a bit deeper into it and gather information that way. Then there's obviously the agent-based solutions where you actually have an agent on the device itself, and that will report back to you. Usually consists or has schedules, so you're telling your discovery I want to run every day at 1 o'clock at night, or weekly or monthly or whatever. And the traditional infrastructure usually has a longer lifespan, longer life cycle. Servers aren't usually set up for just a day. They usually live a bit longer, obviously, because the cost is a lot higher. Yeah, and back in the days, that was the big thing. That was the main information or the main reason you needed information was the cost of acquiring this infrastructure. Then the modern or the cloud-based discovery, basically, it doesn't rely on the old anymore, and it can't rely on it. Usually API-based, instead of sending blindly probes to it, you ask your cloud provider, for example, provide me the data that you already have in your system. So it's kind of like outsourcing discovery to your cloud provider. As you mentioned, tag-based, tags provide you crucial information about your system, which can cut down on your costs, obviously, which we want to do drastically. It can be event-driven, so that instead of reacting based on the information we might get daily, which might already be old, we can switch it to the other point of view, where when things happen, we alert the system about it. We create events. And usually the thing is that the cloud-based resources are very much shorter in life cycle.
I was just like containers and so forth. They might just exist for like 10 minutes, right?
Exactly, and that's why the traditional discovery just doesn't cut it here. Since if you're running daily, the state has changed, definitely has changed hundreds of times during the time between the discoveries. So you're not actually getting good data. You might be getting just completely random stuff, and that's why it has to go the other way around. When things happen, you alert the system. But the issue with both of these discoveries, usually for businesses, is businesses haven't defined what is valuable to them. From the traditional side, some businesses from discovery populate everything from their disk to disk partitions and everything, and they might not do anything with the data. The same thing with the cloud. If your business doesn't use the information of how many pods you have, it's completely a waste of resources to figure out how many you have, or store it somewhere, or create events or anything.
Yeah.
You need to actually use the information that you get from your discovery sources. And to tie all this up, ServiceNow has a tool for creating the relations. Traditional discoveries just finds the things. You have to link them. You have to link them together to get the real value out of it. But you also have to manage the data. You have to be sure that the data you have is accurate. If you have 15 million data points and 90% of that is inaccurate, then pretty much all of it is inaccurate.
Yeah, and to add on to that, so I'm just going to take the screen sharing from here, because what I always hear is that when we're speaking about the discovery in terms of especially Docker and Kubernetes, I don't know if you've ever had this question, Tapio, but like I've often get the question of, Alex, do we really need to know when every pod is created? Do we really need to know every container? Like, what we really care about is our services. And what I mean with services is like microservices, right? So this for me is like a crucial element when we speak about the CMDB. And this is actually one of the greatest challenges of a modern CMDB. So I'm going to try and explain this in a short way here. To the left side, you see a few different examples of clouds. So we have here Azure, we have AWS, and we have Google Cloud. And what happens is that in each cloud, people have their DevOps things like Kubernetes, or they create some sort of app service, or like these functions that I spoke about before, basically microservices and APIs. The problem here, though, is that each cloud becomes indirectly its own little silo. And in average, enterprises today use at least 5 cloud providers. And if each cloud provider have their own little world, then it's very difficult to see how things span across the domains here. So when we speak about microservices, it's often a question on how to model that. Like, yes, we know that there might be 20 Docker containers running somewhere, but we don't care so much about the containers. We know it's in Azure somewhere. We know it's a Kubernetes cluster somewhere. What we really care about is the microservices, like the APIs that humans have defined, the code that the humans have written, the developers that they have written. So how can we model this in a good way? Well, this is all about topologies. So more and more, at least in customer conversations that I have, we see that the DevOps teams within enterprises are struggling with this. They have their repositories like Git or GitLab or whatever it is, but very quickly you notice just like how complicated it becomes to keep track of microservices. Because what we often see is that like a microservice rely on another microservice, which rely on another microservice, etc., etc., etc. So how can we register and how can we keep track of the microservices? Well, in ServiceNow, there are 2 ways of doing this. One is we can actually discover microservices, and we do this based on tags. So practically what that means is that if you have an existing tagging structure, let's say in Kubernetes, in Azure or something like that, then ServiceNow Discovery, like Tapio mentioned, can actually grab those tags, and based out of those tags, we can create service maps out of the microservices. So we don't necessarily need to know the Docker containers. We don't necessarily need to know what is the infrastructure behind. all we need to know is that this piece of functionality has this tag, we should add it into a dependency view, basically. And this is what is being known as tag-based service mapping. I think that a lot of things are moving towards that world with tag-based service mapping. Now, needless to say, not every organization have like a super strict governance and keeping super strict track of all of their tagging operations. So what we also can do in ServiceNow is there is a feature called SRO, or Site Reliability Operations. And developers can then actually register their microservices in ServiceNow. I'm not going to go through in detail today about this piece of functionality, but this functionality, you should know, has an API. And I have seen very many examples where essentially every time you create a new microservice, CI/CD, DevOps type of thing, it gets automatically registered and added to the CMDB. So these two things are possible to do today. It's a little bit tedious, the journey to get there, but it's absolutely worth it, especially if DevOps and microservices is starting to become like a fundamental part of your IT operations. Now, the role of components then, because I think it's always very, very easy to sit here and bash, the old world and say that, the traditional IT is outdated, we don't need to care about it anymore. But that's not true. Traditional IT is still a huge part, and the role of components, it's easy to say, don't care about it. Let's only care about cloud discovery and microservices and DevOps and SREs. I absolutely agree we should put more emphasis there, but yet the role of components, virtual machines, the traditional infrastructure, it shouldn't be neglected. And I always say this, and I just like to mention it specifically like this. Now, I spoke before when I showed the CMDB about the telemetry and metadata, and really telemetry, what I mean with that is monitoring. And whenever I hear monitoring, or when I speak to people about monitoring, they are typically imagining these traditional tools of monitoring where you define your thresholds, maybe you have an integration to ServiceNow, so you create an incident when there is an alert, but it's all kind of reactive and you create the thresholds as you go and that type of things. So if we now zoom out the picture a little bit and we speak about site reliability engineering and monitoring, it's actually a topic which is called observability. And this is something that you will hear a lot about because a lot of organizations, they want to move towards observability. And if you ask 10 different people, you will get 10 different definitions of what observability means. So this is my interpretation of it, but I like to make it simple. First of all, something like this is probably what you're used to when we start to explain or people start to explain how their architecture looks like. As I said, it's hugely complex and it's just, you are taken as a mad scientist when you try to explain the architecture. But observability and monitoring then, it's more than just alerts and thresholds. If we truly speak about observability in a serious way, then we want to include at least these 4 types of data points. So we speak here about metrics, we speak about logs and analytics, we speak about the normal traditional monitoring data, and we speak about topologies and the CMDB. So these 4 data points are extremely important if we want to stay on top of observability. And by the way, for those of you who might wonder, what does Alex mean with observability? I mean, in order to observe the state of a particular application, the true as-is state, how that application is doing right of this minute, that is what I mean with observability. And then you need many data points these days. But the thing here is that these data points on their own only tells part of the truth. But together and combined is when you really can start getting, observability on steroids pretty much. And that's really where ServiceNow comes into the picture with their machine learning capabilities then. And of course, ServiceNow is not unique with this. You will find other solutions out there like Dynatrace and Moogsoft, and pretty much any AiOps tools today will be using machine learning. But this is one of the few areas where machine learning is actually working and doing a good job. Because a few practical examples here. When you apply machine learning here, you can do things such as correlations and groupings. You can start predicting alerts. You can start doing anomaly detection. You can start assisting with root cause analysis. Why? Well, simply because there is no way a human can stay on top of all of this data and read it manually. Remember what I said in the beginning, that I think it was like 50% of organizations or 40% generate 1 million events per day or more. Obviously, you would need an army of people just sitting and looking at those events. So this is a good example where machine learning realistically can be used. But machine learning on its own is worthless. We need the people in order for it to work. So more importantly, we often here need people that can actually look at the results of machine learning, determine whether it's good or bad, because machine learning on its own, it cannot say whether something is good or bad, right or wrong, negative or positive. Most of the time, what it can do is tell you if something is abnormal or if it is normal. You still need people to be able to give that human perspective on things. But also here, when I speak about people, I'm also referring to like the culture of sharing data between teams, the culture of thinking less in a domain-centric view, but more in a holistic view between teams, for example, processes, that type of thing. So a lot of talking, a long monologue here for me, but this is for me what observability means.
Alex, can I add, or actually add a question to you?
Yes.
Well, we have observability. We figured out what the tools for it are, how we can utilize machine learning for it, and then provide information, pre-processed information to people who make the decision, or who will then see the processed information regarding observability. What's the function of observability? Why do we need it? What do we do with it?
For me, observability is all about, we've heard before, we shouldn't be reactive, we should be proactive. But for me, observability takes it even a step further, that we shouldn't be reactive, and being proactive, it's not enough either. We should be predictive. And if we can observe how things are operating under normal conditions, then we can also predict things when they are not operating during normal conditions, let's say. So that is, for me, at least, how I view on observability personally. I
agree. And usually these things are considered as something technical, something that you're monitoring or preserving your services. But there is a business side to it as well, because your business will need to make the decisions of what we're going to do in the future based on where we are now and where we were before.
Yeah.
And this information.
For sure. And they will use the data of IT systems to base their decisions on. That's for sure.
Exactly.
Yeah. No, absolutely. So we have this observability maturity model. Now, granted, I'm not going to have time to go through this entire observability maturity model now. So you will get this as a sent out after the webinar. It's a PDF. You'll get it just as a nice giveaway for free, where you can kind of see how it looks from a ServiceNow perspective, to move from having this kind of reactive human intervention to machine learning assisted, and finally to a predictive and observability stage. Okie dokie, with only 10 minutes left, I see that we've had a few questions, really good questions from Ilka here. I am not sure if we will be able to take those questions straight here now on the call with only 10 minutes left, but what I'll do is we'll reach out to Ilka afterwards, because this is some quite interesting questions, and maybe we will create some sort of follow-up with all of these questions, so we share them with the audience. But the journey then, we've been speaking about conceptual things, we have been speaking about TOIL, we have been speaking about the nature of SREs, kind of how things have developed and what direction it's moving towards. Now, let's take it down to earth. How can we really get here using the ServiceNow platform? Well, first of all, there are some organizational pillars that needs to be in place. So from a cultural aspect, and you and me, Tapio, just before the call here today or the webinar had some good, interesting discussions here. For me, it's at least about sharing data. Sharing data between the teams, knowing kind of how can other teams access my data, what data are we generating. If we're speaking about observability, how does that data look in terms of monitoring, in terms of measuring? How can we truly share our data and create that sort of open, embracing data culture within the company? That for me is super important. I guess you agree there as well, Tapio.
Yeah, definitely. And not just about sharing the data, but perhaps even just giving an opportunity for your other systems to get access to the data. If you don't want to push it everywhere all the time, it can be in the future, your other business or other services might want to have some of the data you weren't sharing before, but
yeah,
just having access to it and allowing all the other services to expand with knowledge from other services as well.
That's right. Yeah, exactly. Good addition. And then, of course, as I mentioned in the beginning, if we are serious about SRE operations, then considering reliability super early is very, very important. So whenever we're provisioning a new service of some sort, whenever we're considering to expand a service, introduce new microservices, whatever it might be, reliability should be included like from day one. We do not launch a service at all without having very, very in a minuscule level consider the reliability parts of it. And finally, I think it's super important to try and evolve beyond ITIL. I am not saying that we should throw out ITIL through the window because incidents and changes and so forth will still be a valid concept. But at the same time, we cannot be stuck in this bubble of ITIL all the time either. But we need to grant some flexibility there. And of course, that's almost a philosophical discussion, and we could probably have debates around this. But that is at least my opinion from an organizational perspective. So these are the main organizational pillars, the cultural aspects, I would say. If we're now looking here as one of the final slides on the technical pillars then to reach observability, and I'm now speaking from a ServiceNow platform perspective, I am first assuming here that a basic ITSM is set up. And by the way, these things are based on reality. I have worked, as I said before, we have worked here together with like 20, 30 customer cases in these areas. So the first thing is, I think it's a quick win to integrate any CI/CD pipelines, so DevOps operations, to change management. There are huge benefits with that, simply because we want to expose the world of DevOps to the world of ITSM and IT operations. We don't want to let the DevOps, run wild on their own necessarily, but we want to give that transparency and visibility in what is actually going on. It doesn't mean that every change needs to be approved, by the way, but it should be integrated in some sort of way. So that's the quick win, and you can do this without any additional licensing model or anything like that. Then I always say that creating that data layer, if you haven't started that work already, so AKA a CMDB, hugely important. I would prioritize here the visibility to cloud if you have that. The reason here is simple, because if you have visibility to cloud, if you know what resources have been created, what has been decommissioned, what has been spin up over time, etc., trust me, the bills and the invoices you get from Amazon and Azure or Google will make way, way more sense. So getting that visibility into the cloud is kind of a key here, in my opinion. But then, of course, as well as I said, don't forget about the on-prem and traditional IT. Then connecting basic telemetry. It doesn't mean that you need to be the very best with the latest Dynatrace and APM and all of these things, but if you have some existing monitoring tools, connect them to ServiceNow. If you do these 3 things, it usually takes 6 to 12 months, and trust me, your organization will be on a higher maturity than, I would say, 80% of the most common ones. If you manage to build these 3 layers here, then you are very, very well far off into the maturity scale. Then you need to ask yourself and consider, what is truly important for us on a long-term basis? Are we interested in these service topologies, like microservices, like I mentioned, tag-based service mapping, whatever it is? Are we more interested maybe in AiOps capabilities, like machine learning? Or is it more like the automation parts that we truly are interested in? The reason that you should ask yourself this is that depending on where your priorities lie, then you might essentially be able to optimize the licensing models and the cost and implementation and so forth. But if you do these things, then you really are on the, let's say, cutting edge. Then you are pushing the ServiceNow platforms to its limits, and still within the capabilities of what it can do, but then you are ahead of a lot of other organizations. So these for me are the technical pillars, so to speak. And of course, there are other aspects to this. I don't know, Tapio, if you'd like to add something particular, but I think the basics here of the quick wins, the data layers, and essentially connecting events is more than enough for most organizations, at least.
Yeah, definitely. And addition to your the considerations part, when you're assessing if your business is interested in these, if you say no, then list why. So, because usually your decisions are based on the current situation. Situation always changes. That's the only constant.
Yeah, absolutely. So with that being said, this was really just scratching the surface here a little bit of what observability means, the site reliability engineering practices, and how it relates to ServiceNow. Granted, we have only scratched the surface. We have only spoke about it on a high level perspective. But if you would like to have more conversations about this, you can scan the QR code in front of you, and you will be connected to either me or Tapio. There will be a follow-up recording on this. And of course, you should follow the Cloud people or Einar Partners on LinkedIn, just to stay up to date. And in general, this is an area which we are very, very passionate about. And we would love to hear more from you if you have any questions or if you have any curiosities in it. But with that being said, I think we are within the time limit, Tapio, and yeah, at least from my perspective, I'd like to thank the audience very much for their time here today. So what do you say, Tapio? Should we wrap it up?
Yes, and thank you to all the audience, and have a great midsummers.
Yes, exactly. Have a great midsummer, guys. Super cool. Thank you all.